Welcome to Deep Transformation. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, author of the award-winning book, Integral Recovery. And today we get to explore a topic which is both of enormous importance and enormous interest. And that is the way in which cultures evolve and the particular stage or phase that we ourselves are now in, where our culture has evolved to and the direction it's moving. To help us explore that intriguing and profound topic is Brendan Graham Dempsey. Brendan is a multifaceted man, to be sure. He's the first farmer we've had on this on this program, but he's also more than that. He's a poet. He is director of a retreat center and a very extensive writer who's written on a wide variety of topics, particularly on cultural evolution, on metamodernism, and on emerging spirituality. His most recent book is Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. And Brendan may have cracked the code of cultural evolution. He, as far as I can see, he may have identified some of the fundamental processes at work which underlie the way in which cultures change and evolve, including ours. And that's what we want to focus on today. Two themes: the way cultures evolve and the most recent stage of culture, metamodernism. So, Brandon, welcome. It's great to have you with us. And perhaps we can start by asking you to tell us what are the main stages that you see, you and a number of other observers see culture as having moved through?
Yeah, great question. And thank you so much for the invitation, and really appreciate and honored by the opportunity to come on and talk about this topic, which to me is a very fascinating and important one. Yeah, I mean, we can kind of begin with tackling that issue, I guess, trying to sort of develop or frame things in a sort of stage-like or phase-like progression, a kind of taxonomy of stages that people can think about. I think a lot of folks will get a sense of the modern world, and they probably heard about modernism and modernity and the postmodern turn and then postmodernity. And these are actually instances of a kind of process that unfolds as culture reflects on itself. But in terms of trying to identify what these major kind of epochs are, these delineating stages, there are different ways you can kind of slice that pie. But I find it very valuable to think of just to start out the conversation as offering those, as I said, the sort of pre-modern, modern, postmodern. We'll get into talking about what the metamodern is in a minute. And I think folks may have a decent grasp of that, maybe intuitively, in the sense of what premodernity suggests, and what we can dive into all of these. But what the modern world seems to have brought with it, and then what the postmodern paradigm is about. Though I would also add that I think it's meaningful to be able to further divide what we talk about as the pre-modern, and actually identify some other kind of stages within that. And if you go back further, right, in that progression, you can actually see that the pre-modern era has something of a phase we might call more like the traditional, which I think is very appropriately linked to a lot of axial age religion. And there's a kind of meaningful separation or distinction that happens with the axial age, which is a term that Carl Jaspers coined to talk about this moment around 500 BC, where you see the emergence of the world religions. And so, of course, that means there is a rupture from an even previous era. And you can think about that as maybe sort of the era of the great agricultural civilizations, right? Something like, you can call it the archaic period, or just the imperial kind of cultural code. And then going all the way back, we see that kind of began with the dawn of agriculture, and there were human societies before that flourished for many, many thousands of years. So you can kind of locate a sort of Neolithic, kind of hunter-gatherer, oral indigenous epoch to human culture. So when you lay all those out kind of in kind of chronological sequence, you get sort of a long period of very rich and diverse hunter-gatherer Neolithic societies, and then a real change with the rise of imperial societies, of agricultural empires, and then that emerging into the Axial Age, where you get this sort of flowering of all these kind of abstract world religious philosophies. And then that is really what gets sort of superseded with the rise of modernity in a major way in the first well in the or let's people date that differently, but when we talk about it in sort of Western context, that we can see that as being sort of really initiated with the early Renaissance period and the move out of the Middle Ages. And then you get the postmodern period, which arises after the modern period, and that can be variously dated, but certainly really comes to flowering sometime in the mid 20th century. And of course, now we're talking about, well, what comes after the postmodern, and what does that look like? And so people are talking now about a metamodern cultural moment, and that in many ways kind of dawns in the beginning of, well, around 2000, let's say, but certainly, over the last 20 or so years, so fairly recent. So yeah, there's a way of sort of looking at the broad swath of human history and identifying meaningful patterns or structures that seem to cohere and organize civilizational epochs and modes of social cohesion and worldview structures that help cohere those civilizations, and sort of map that across however many that is, I don't know, five or six or so, kind of broad stages.
And as you do that, or as we think of human evolution and social evolution, it's pretty easy to see the external manifestations. There's a big change from Stone Age tools to the beginning of civilizations, to industrializations, to the information technology,
AI and quantum computers. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Right. Yeah. But you're looking at the more subtle or mental aspects of our shared ways of understanding, of perceiving, of framing, etc. So what exactly are these worldviews or cultures? What actually constitutes these shifts?
Yeah, so this is the most fascinating aspect of this issue to me, because when we're talking about cultures, obviously cultures are the collective products of individual human action and thought. And so cultures are collective entities. And so when you think about the units of culture, what makes up a culture, you're talking about individual people. And there's a very fascinating way in which cultures both then can be viewed at the individual lens, but also need to be viewed at the collective lens. And when you think about what's really going on with culture and what's kind of unique to human beings, really, and how what we're doing as animals is a very different phenomenon than other sentient mammals, let's say, on the planet. You start to appreciate the deeply intertwined nature between our individual mental, psychological lives and the collective sort of sociological realities that are playing out. And so the big crucial sort of innovation of Homo sapiens is language, and that is this mediating medium. It's the means by which we are individually shaped, and it's also the means by which culture itself kind of plays out. It's sort of the information processing system of culture. So every individual is both, yes, an individual, but they're also an individual by means of participating in a broader collective, linguistically mediated society. And so there's something fundamentally kind of open between the individual and the collective, that we're using language as sort of a medium that flows from person to person and therefore goes out into the world and then kind of unites or bridges the divide between individual entities and the collective. So why that's important, I think, is that what that means is that there's necessarily a very crucial way in which psychology plays into understanding culture itself. And we want to, of course, avoid certain reductionisms here. We don't just want to say we can understand all of culture through the lens of human psychology, but we do need a psychological lens to bring to culture. We can also look at individuals through the lens of sociology, right? Because it's this two-way thing. So hopefully there's an element of that makes sense to folks, that we are very kind of porous in the way that we get identified, and our minds get shaped, both in relationship to the societies that we live in, and to, you know, person-to-person exchanges. So what's really interesting then is that you can look at different ways that society forms social, coherent organizational structures through the lens of how people think. As certain kinds of, you can call them, yeah, worldviews or justification systems. There's something that we're doing together that uses language in a way that that is identifiable at the psychological level, and then works as a means to cohere groups of people together according to sort of shared ideas, shared principles, shared values. So one of the most fascinating things, again, to me about studying cultural evolution is looking at those sequences that we were just talking about, you know, from sort of hunter-gatherer societies and the Neolithic period to agricultural societies, and then to the axial age shift, and then modernity, postmodernity, and metamodernity, to look at that whole unfolding process as one of, let's say, through the lens of psychological change, and coming to what ultimately amounts to a kind of complexification process of certain modes of thought in a way that maps very interestingly to the manner in which societies themselves become more complex. You get more moving parts. You get more differentiated aspects of societies having to work together in an integrated way and gain coherency. And so individuals and collective organisms sort of complexify in tandem with one another. And then, yeah, I mean, we can then kind of look at what those specific moments of that complexification process look like across those different stages. And I'm happy to kind of try to, you know, give a suggestion or, you know, an approximation of what some of that looks like if you want to.
Yeah, and largely, you know, I'm very intricately informed, and so my first metamodern encounter was Hansi Freinax with the Listening Society.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I really digging it. I said, "This is amazing." I said, "This is integral." I've heard all this in different words.
Sure.
So, yeah, and your ideas also, and the idea that to move from modernism to postmodernism to post-post or metamodernism, there's a deconstructive thing that has to happen. And from listening to your podcast, you grew up in a very traditional religious background, and I had very much that experience too in my life. And when I moved into this modern phase, I had to deconstruct a lot of my beliefs and leave that stuff behind. Later on, I had to go back and reconstruct it, you know, and separate, you know, the nonsense from the treasure, and a very, very helpful process. So that gets a lot into, well, the postmodern gift of the deconstruction, which they did. And I was very in integral terms. We talk about the green level. And I was there for a long time, and I got really just depressed on the cynicism and the sarcasm, and, you know, just the everything sucks in the world, you know. It's like, okay. And so they hadn't gotten to the reconstructive part. Well, what's the next thing? What's the thing that gives us goodness, truth, and beauty? How does that apply now? And see where I was going to go with that. And yeah, so I started, you know, doing that in my own head. And then when I found developmental groups and spiral dynamics and different ones that I've studied, and talking to people and listening to them, asking questions and just listening, done a lot of field research on these levels. And it's fascinating. And as you brought out in your book, there is a problem in our academic systems with postmodernism that has largely led to a dead end and gutting a lot of the major fields of study without offering anything better, if you will, or more functional or a new vision. So I think anyway, that's some of my understanding of what you're doing and what I've seen in my own life and my own work.
Yeah,
No,
there's definitely a lot of overlap with well, I'm sorry, Roger, do you want to say something?
no, well, I was going to say that I think, John, you've just given us a biographical tour of the major major stages. And I was going to suggest that Brendan, maybe you'd like to just maybe you want to respond in other ways at first, but it would be great since
Yeah.
John has given us this overview through his own life of the different stages. Maybe it'd be great if you could characterize each of these stages for us in a
Sure.
little
Yeah.
more detail.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to a lot of the kindred connection with the integral framework that some aspects of the metamodern discourse certainly exhibit. I mean, there's you mentioned Hansi Freinach's work. In many ways, that that set of works is yeah, kind of an extension of integral thought, comes out of integral thinking. One of the things that I was really interested in when I went to write my book on metamodernism was trying to synthesize a lot of the different forms of metamodern thought that were out there, the majority of which didn't come from integral backgrounds, but and yet seem to be pointing in a similar kind of direction. So I think people who will read my book on that topic will see a similar sense of like, oh yeah, these patterns sound somewhat familiar if you have an integral background, and we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, let me just say in Integral Friends back in the day when we were talking about these things, we said that this is a new level of consciousness that is arising, whether people have heard about Ken Wilber or not, it's going to be emerging in the collective scene. And I think the metamodern critique without Ken Wilber is very useful in that it kind of says it in a different way. Toggles, similarities in a different way and adds depth and just fresh insights.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, and we can come back to that, I'm sure, when we talk more about metamodernism and sort of the genesis of the book and whatnot. Because yeah, its relationship with integral and with other modes of thought is a really important topic, and one that also has generated a lot of buzz and controversy in some of the discussion around this, and understandably so. So I'm happy to dig into all of that. But yeah, in terms of trying to paint in some more complete descriptions, I think again, people will probably resonate very much with a sort of movement from the traditional modern postmodern, which at the individual level, kind of psychologically speaking, has its own way that it plays out. I mean, one of the claims in this approach to cultural evolution is that there's some form of isomorphic relationship between the individual mind as it unfolds and complexifies and develops, and the collective society in which it's a part, right? That's sort of one of the big ideas that's sort of an orienting framework for being able to make sense of these really fascinating analogs that you see at both the individual and these collective levels. So at the same time, I will say more about this again also when we come to metamodernism, but that needs to be done very carefully, and I think some of the specifics of how that unfolds is still yet to be kind of fully unpacked, and I try to do a little bit of that in my book, but it's more the work I'm writing at the moment that is really trying to dig into much more of the mechanics of this, because it's something we have to be, as I say, careful about in drawing distinct relationships between these different levels of individual and collective. We don't want to fall into any kind of overly simplistic one-to-one relationships and that sort of a thing. So that being said, there are, I do believe, very meaningful ways that these sort of stages do match up with each other. And so to use my life as an example, as mentioned, I was raised in a very traditionally religious family, in a very kind of in a mode of belief that held to inerrancy of scripture and belief in miracles, and a very kind of just much more traditional mode of relating to the religious tradition. Uh, Again, also not a direct sort of similarity, but there are definitely overlaps in the way that I was brought up to relate to my faith, and the way that, say, people in a medieval context maybe would have related to their faith, as sort of a kind of just belief that these events recounted in their scriptures kind of took place, and sort of, occurred as related to them, and that there are all sorts of phenomena that can occur that are miraculous and that disrupt the, you could say, the laws of nature. Though, of course, the very idea of the laws of nature is a kind of modern idea that gets invented at that period. So anyway, there's an interesting way in which you can look at more conservative traditional forms of religiosity, such as I was raised in, and make a comparison with the forms of religion that come out of the axial age and the way that people relate to, the other world, the supernatural realm, the sacred history, the sacred drama of reality, and the relationship of your soul to God, and the moral life that needs to be lived in order to sort of put you on the right kind of spiritual path. So I came from that tradition, and I was actually so interested in it, and so I found it to be of such ultimate concern that I thought, well, I should really devote myself to this, and that began a process of study. I thought, well, I'll become a Bible scholar because this is the most important thing, and this is the most important text. So when I got to college, I studied Greek and Hebrew and Latin and the classical languages in order to read the New Testament. I took a lot of classes in the history of Christianity and some Bible as literature classes, and just kind of really delved very deeply into actually biblical scholarship. I wrote an extensive honors thesis exploring ancient Second Temple Jewish apocalypticism, etc. I'll spare you the details. But point being, I got really into the sort of academic.
I love that stuff, by the way, Brendan.
Yeah, and if people are interested in that, I'm putting out some videos that relates to some of those topics that I studied at this period. So if you're interested, you can check out my YouTube channel for some of that. But yeah, so I got really interested in the academic study and kind of applying reason and history and sort of modern methods of analysis to the traditional texts. And the result of that was very much it gave a different account or a different story relative to the one that I'd grown up with. It was a very different take, and that forced this kind of really kind of a crisis of faith then. And here I was grappling with evidence and, as I say, history and these more scientific methodologies, and trying to make this square with my earlier form of faith. And there was a profound disruption that occurred, and I very much, I think you can see that also playing out collectively in cultural evolution as what happened with the rise of modernity. And that really happened in a big way by the time you start getting into later modernity, where you do see the emergence of, modern biblical criticism and that sort of a thing. Just to use the Christian traditions as a specific example of this, that you could say collectively, this kind of meaning crisis shows up as a result of this modernization process that was sort of something that I experienced directly at a psychological level in my own individual life. So that would be sort of the move from the traditional into the modern. And briefly,
Brendan,
yeah.
Can I ask you how that shift from your traditional, and studying the Bible and your degrees and all this, what happened? What was that personal deconstructive process like for you? And was that very painful, or was it pretty abrupt, or how did that go?
Yeah. So to zoom in on that, it started actually in high school. I've always been inquisitive and really wanted to kind of have a better sense of the evidence and the kind of rational grasp of my faith. And so already in high school, I was starting to explore my faith from that angle, and that kind of caused some bumps in the road then. But it wasn't until late high school and then ultimately into early college years where I really started to get into the real biblical studies aspect of this, that really began to rock the boat in a much more profound way. Earlier on, that the kind of initial response to some of these issues was to adopt the what's called apologetics approach in Christian theology, which is you try to get very rational, evidence-based arguments that support your traditional belief structure. So it's sort of like, supporting the faith using the rules of modernity. And that worked for a little bit to kind of short things up. But the more that I studied, I realized that's not going to ultimately pan out. And it was in college where these studies really, began to, as I say, kind of take hold. I'd already, even in my late high school years, studied sort of the biblical composition history of the Hebrew Bible, and that had revealed a very different story than the one I was raised with. Which the one I was raised with, the story went, well, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and then each of the prophets wrote their books, etc. But I studied this now, and it was very clear, based on, you read about the documentary hypothesis works like Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible and this sort of a thing, who helped popularize this in kind of more general conversation spaces, that it's very clear that these are actually multiple sources that have been interwoven with each other, and that there aren't single authors, but these have been constructed over hundreds of years and then assembled and redacted. And it's a lot messier of a compositional history than kind of traditional, let's say, evangelical framings suggest. So I'd already kind of chewed on that for a while and was okay enough with that. But of course, that was the Old Testament, as Christians call it. So things didn't really get hairy for me until I turned to the New Testament. And I'd already now seen the incredible clarity that these methods could bring to a text, and the kind of very convincing evidence that could be shown to make certain cases about, what was going on with these texts and trying to date them and all that sort of a thing. So when I turned to the New Testament as a Christian and started studying what's called historical Jesus scholarship, and trying to get back to who is this person, what did he believe, what did he actually say, how do we know, all that, studying the Gospels, seeing their differences, how they related to each other, what sources they were drawing from, and all of that, that was when things really shook up for me, because the kind of takeaway from that in consensus biblical scholarship is a picture of the historical Jesus as a figure who preached an apocalyptic message about the end of the world that hasn't happened and certainly didn't happen in the time frame that it seems that figure was suggesting it would. And so when you get a picture like that and you feel a similar sense of conviction that, oh gosh, well, that does seem to be where a lot of the evidence points to, then that was really the thing that knocked the whole thing out from under my feet, and caused, a lot of grappling, despair, uncertainty, anxiety, confusion, vertigo is kind of what I call it. It's just the sense of you don't know which way is up. You're not sure what you can trust, what's fundamental anymore. The very kind of structure of your world has begun to erode, or you could say deconstruct, right? And so you're looking for some place of certainty and you can't find it. So that was very disruptive for me, for sure. And
By the way, Brendan, I think that's a great description of the disruptional movement between worldviews, fundamental belief systems. I mean, it's a great personal description, and the kind of, I guess the technical term would be you're in a liminal phase between whether you want to call them myths or worldviews or whatever. But anyway, great description. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no.
I just need to say that you took the tools of modernity and you applied them to the traditional. That's when through that process, the deconstruction happened. And I want to applaud your homework you've done on the subject. It's very profound. So
thanks. Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, and as we'll get to in a second, I mean, one of the things I didn't have the foresight of going through that. I just, but I've come to appreciate now is that, there are successful ways that people can work through these things and come to very still profound, robust senses of faith, religion, Christianity specifically, but any kind of religion, I do believe, can move through these deconstructive processes and actually land somewhere much stronger and more robust and ultimately more sophisticated and complex and profound on the other side. So that's really what my work is all about. Though at the time I didn't know that. I was just going through this profound sense of deconstruction. And to tie this a little bit into the cultural evolution bit, right, is that this is, as you say, Roger, like a moving into the liminal between space, that exists between these worldviews. I didn't have any of this framework or map, at the time. So for me, it just felt like my world falling apart. But yeah, this is kind of how these things work, that the psyche kind of has a structure to it that can kind of hold things together, you could say. And as I was saying earlier, that's directly related to social structures and how certain kinds of social organization hold together. And so when that set of that container, you can say, starts to deconstruct and fall apart, you're just between worlds. And I did ultimately land in a fairly kind of modern worldview, one much more informed by sort of modern science, and at that time was really grappling a lot with issues of materialism, reductionism, determinism, I didn't know how you could live a moral life if we're all just sort of fluke accidents, who kind of showed up for no reason ultimately in this sort of dark, uncaring void. It was a very kind of difficult time. And related to that was a lot of the nihilism that shows up also with the grappling with the issue of plurality and difference, right? Of seeing that actually there are all sorts of worldviews, as it came to be, made clear to me that that there's different ways to be religious. There's secularity and atheism, agnosticism. There's all these things, and that there was a strong emphasis in the culture towards appreciating the kind of radical relativity of all these different perspectives, and that itself being a kind of frame that people can inhabit. And so, yeah, this is a way, hopefully people are kind of intuiting of like seeing how individually you can kind of move through these worldviews that have been developed in these cultural contexts to make sense of reality and make sense of the world, and do their own sort of work to cohere social groups and whatnot. And so it was a very profoundly disruptive and disorienting time that it took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around.
Yeah, and it's not a minor thing you're talking about. You're talking about effectively multiple shifts, and to change one's worldview is a very radical and rare thing. I mean, it usually happens for people if in their adult life. Often doesn't happen, but if it, once or more than once is very rare, and you've been through several. And I just want to point to a couple of things that you pointed to very briefly. One is the sense of inner turmoil and confusion and groundlessness that you went through, which is so often interpreted by people as a sign that there's something wrong with them, and is one of the reasons that worldview shifts are hard and people don't go through them. And how much it takes what psychologists call a tolerance of ambiguity, a willingness to not know, and to come to some acceptance of that. And it seems like as depth that opens into an appreciation of mystery, which you certainly have. And I'm reminded also of what feels like a very powerful teaching from the Carlos Castaneda books, in which the traps of a person of knowledge, there are 4 traps. One is fear. One, as you step out on the path and start to gain some skills, is power, the seductions of power. The final one is old age or losing one's vitality and just giving up in some form. But the third one is what's most interesting, the trap of clarity, that we can become attached to clarity. And when we're clear, that means we are fixed in a particular worldview or stage or frame. And what it takes to move beyond that requires a willingness to let go of that frame and the clarity that goes with it, and step into the kind of confusion you so beautifully described.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, and one I often try to make, which is that it is difficult for those reasons, but I think that looking at this process through the lens of learning theory is just what to me eventually came to make so much sense once I discovered it, because this is essentially how that it gives a sense to those moments of senselessness, where we do live in these worlds to help us navigate our reality, and as long as that's working well, then that sort of worldview seems to be, let's say, adaptive, right? It's doing what it kind of needs to be doing. And if people are flourishing and thriving in their context, then that's a successful worldview. But what happens inevitably is that things do change and we bump up against the limits of things. Maybe we go and encounter new knowledge, or maybe another group with another worldview, we come into encounter with them, and then we have to make sense of this difference. And so there's always this process going on where we tend to want to assimilate everything to what we already know, which is called assimilation in kind of learning theory. And it's when we bump up against something that doesn't let us do that, that we have to then accommodate to reality, as it is, as we can't just kind of shape it to our own way of seeing. And that's what goes on every time we are able to learn something new. And when we're able to learn something new, we're able to take new information about the world in and sort of update our sense of the world. And yeah, and if that happens in sort of enough ways, with enough sort of information speaking to what we thought was maybe more foundational, then we are sort of forced to grapple with this sense of, maybe my old worldview, I need to move out of and transcend and get beyond. But rather than see that as a collapse and this sort of failure, right? It's actually an invitation to expand and to grow and to enter a more comprehensive vision, in the same way that, learning a new model of something and how it works, that's more comprehensive and complete than an earlier, less complete model. It's very much in that vein. And so, again, bringing it back to the issue of cultural evolution, I think it's a very powerful idea that, in a qualified way, we can appreciate that there are these gains made as we collectively and as individuals learn more through interaction with novel information, and are able to update our understanding of reality accordingly and enter new spaces, new worlds that open us up more, and make us more adaptive and more able to flourish in relationship to more of reality. So I find that a very encouraging mode that took me a long time to find as a framework for making sense of my own multiple deconstructions.
Yeah, and it helps if you have a supportive community
Mm.
to help you through this transition, and it's much more heroic if you don't. So did you feel you had people that were there with you helping you through this, or did you do this largely on your own?
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't, and that was a big source of the difficulty. One of the things I'm really trying to make the case for in the work I'm doing now, is to try to encourage people to take deconstruction and these, well, deep transformations seriously, in a way that folds them into the spiritual journey itself, so that when people do deconstruct, or do question, or do doubt, or do fall between the cracks of worlds, that's not a totally upending, earth-shattering, and lonely and isolating experience. It's actually, oh yeah, no, this is, people said this would happen, and this is all part of the spiritual path itself. Unfortunately, the worlds that we live in, we do try very hard to protect and defend against being, ruptured. There's sort of an immune response whenever something comes by, and it's like, oh, this is anomalous. This doesn't fit my paradigm. Like, destroy, destroy. And so that tends to be the case, that communities of all kinds are much more apt to meet anomaly and contradiction and cognitive dissonance with pushing away, rejection, and repression. And so that's something that needs to be, kind of accepted as, in some ways, an aspect of things. But if we're able to create really healthy forms of religion and spirituality, we can, I think, anticipate these dynamics by folks who have gone through these experiences, and then kind of having come back from those experiences to help build them into, the religious pedagogy and the catechism that people move through, so that it's actually part of the process. And you mentioned the hero, there is a hero's journey element to this whole process, right? We move from the familiar world, and then we go down into the unfamiliar world. We go out into the liminal zone of chaos, there be dragons. We don't know what's out there. But we have to, because our current world is not doing well, whatever the story, whether it's the famine, or there's the tyrannical king, or whatever, something is constricting and lacking. And so we're forced out into, this unknown zone to go explore. And there we find hardship, and there you find tribulation and trial. But you do encounter the dragon, and you do get the pearl of great price, and you do then wind up returning to the world with that thing that can rejuvenate it and expand it. And that is what that's what the learning process is about. And I think that that's what the spiritual process itself is speaking to. And of course, Campbell and other folks, Peterson, have kind of drawn on the works of folks like Carl Jung, who interpreted this very much as the individuation process of the psyche. To become who we are, we have to go out of ourselves and our existing worldviews. We have to deconstruct and then reconstruct, and that this is a meaningful social process that we can partake in that can help the world, that we can collectively help the world update its model, especially in times when our collective world-making, sense-making structures are failing. And that's where we are certainly at the moment with the meta crisis, the meaning crisis. Collectively, our worldview is breaking down, and we're being forced out to go try to bring out of that chaos some order, which is to say a new level of complexity. And that's a lot of what the metamodern, next step in this cultural evolution process is in some ways trying to help facilitate for people.
Well, we've got you. That was a beautiful description of the hero's journey you just gave. So thank you for that. And we've gotten you up to your modern phase, and we're using your. It seems like we're using John's and your lives as examples of this kind of progression. So, was there a corresponding process of that accompanied your opening into the postmodern phase?
Yeah. And for me, I already mentioned a little bit about some of that relativism that I was grappling with. For me, the move into the modern was followed pretty quickly by then exploring the kind of postmodern frame. I think probably the big initiation into that was through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who I started to read a lot at this point, who's often kind of taken as a sort of kind of forerunner of certain elements of postmodern thought, to the degree that the very notion of truth sort of becomes problematized. It's sort of whose truth, the kind of famous paraphrased line of Nietzsche is, there are no facts, only interpretations, right? And we're sort of thrust into the mode of just the perspectival universe. Everyone's coming from their own perspective. And of course, Nietzsche was also very cognizant of the way that power influences how we see the world and the sorts of ways that we frame worlds to ourselves. So I think that was a big aspect for bringing that into the mix. There were other folks through just reading, but also just living in, at that time, this would have been, maybe around 2012, 2013, 2014. And so, postmodernism very much in the air. And to the degree that actually I really felt like I needed to learn about it, I started reading about modernism, postmodernism, to get a sense of what these things were, because it was very clear that let's say there had been these shifts in culture. I was very aware that sort of Western culture itself had gone through collectively, as I said, this sort of meaning crisis, death of God experience, which of course Nietzsche also was sort of the prophet of. And so I wanted to know more about what was going on there. How had we gone from, kind of collectively being religious to collectively secular, and started looking a lot into, as I say, sort of the modes of shifting from, premodern to modernist to postmodernist. And yeah, that was sort of that element of that, which also for me landed in what I can say now is a very reactionary way. I really didn't like a lot of postmodern art. I was grappling a lot with, this issue of, is everything really just radically relative, or is there anything we can hold on to? And there was a sort of postmodern answer that I kind of landed on, which was something around aestheticism, right? Well, it's like, well, we can't know anything for sure. All we really can go from is our own individual experience. And therefore, how do things feel? Do they feel good? Is there a sensory experience that can't be denied? A sort of like postmodern fundamentalist sense of like, whatever there is, there's things we can feel, and giving up in a way on the notion of truth.
And there is truth in that. Also.
There is. And to be fair, right, there's truth in all of these modes. There's really important novel insights in all of these new worlds that we enter through these deconstructive phases. Because if there wasn't, it wouldn't be learning. It's always about how do we properly relate to the new insights in these different worldviews, together in a way that actually does allow us to be highly adaptive and flourishing. So that was sort of my postmodern phase. But then, having now become aware of all of these things, I did start to ask the question, okay, well, what comes after the postmodern, right? I mean, if there's a pre-modern, modern, postmodern, presumably this goes on. So who's talking about that? And around, this was actually around 2013, I started looking around, seeing who might be talking about that. And that's when I discovered metamodernism.
And Brendan, of these different cultural stages, it seems like postmodernism is a particularly hard one for a lot of people to wrap their heads around and get a clear sense of. So you spoke a little about the multiplicity of perspectives, interpretations. Could you flesh that out a little more? What characterizes postmodernism?
Yeah, so like all of these, right? They're sort of definable relative to what they're responding to. So it's postmodernism. Postmodernism is responding to modernism. And so if the modernists looked at the world and said, hey, actually, we have reason and universal reason and logic that we can use to make sense of reality and all kind of come to, the collective right answer and use that to get us to some wonderful utopian future where we're heading towards greater progress and increasing our technological, power over nature. And won't that all be grand? That was sort of the modern vision. Postmodernism critiques all that. It really comes to the fore after World War II, as a response to a lot of just the cataclysms and the horrors of the 20th century, which seemed like the failure of modern thought, of basically leading us not towards progress, but deploying all of this reason and logic and technology towards destruction, that the iron cage of modernity, as it's been called, and the whole way that, modern industrialism in this incredible sense of, development and progress could actually be directed towards the death camps and towards genocide. So there became a profound skepticism and cynicism that entered in really and came to prominence after World War II, and in a way that just questioned all of that. And it also then drew a lot of attention to the fact that, let's say, well, it drew attention to the problems with thinking in those terms. And so if we don't have an absolute knowledge or an absolute reason that can give us the answer, what do we have? Well, we have perspectives. We have a whole bunch of different ways to see the world. There is no God's eye view or view from nowhere. Everyone is operating from a context. Everyone is operating based on their past experience. And a lot of the modernist thought that had oriented everything towards progress and looked at history as a series of sort of evolutionary stages that led, of course, naturally to European colonialism and imperialism, and justified certain forms of basically dehumanization and the extermination or the exploitation of certain groups of people under the pretenses that they were less evolved and this sort of a thing. All of that became thoroughly and again rightly critiqued, because it revealed itself to be not an aspect of progress, but an aspect of domination and oppression. But then this sort of view winds up, in many ways, sort of rejecting evolutionary thought entirely, and sort of saying that there are no meaningful differences. Cultures are just not the same. They're just different. There's nothing meaningful we can use to talk about any kind of progress. And so the very notion of progress itself just gets thrown out the window. And if anything, everything has maybe gotten worse. And there's just, as I say, a profound sense of cynicism, skepticism. If we can't know anything and there isn't really a truth, then the best thing we can do is just say what isn't true. We can just doubt everything. And so you get this emergence of a kind of cool cynicism that the best you can do is just say, oh, that's stupid, that's dumb. We can mock everything at the very least, right? So then you get the rise of postmodern culture, which is very much about just a send up and a satire of everything, The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, that sort of a thing, which is all just a critique of sort of the naive, now seeming ideals of modern life. And so that very much is sort of the postmodern sensibility that emerges in the latter 20th century. You also see that because no one can really speak to value in any way that is actually universal, then you sort of abandon any pretenses to there being things like values. And so the only sort of adjudicator of values is either power or basically the market. And so you get this sort of rampant consumerism, consumption, and this sort of we've checked out of ideals. Ideals were a bad idea. We're just going to lay back, watch television, and live the happy days. You want a jouissance, this joy, this, or not really. It's not really a joy. It's a playfulness. Everything's just play and satire and very light and frilly. And so art at this time becomes things like Jeff Koons's Big Balloon Dog, as sort of everything's a send up, everything's a joke. So that's sort of the logic of that, if you want to call it a worldview. Though, of course, this is one of the big challenges, is that you can't really build a worldview out of critique. Nothing really binds people together if we're all just sort of skeptical of each other, doubting each other, cynical, and waiting to see who's actually got the upper hand power-wise.
Or as you said in your book, eventually we have to negate the negative.
Exactly. And again, that's another kind of setup for where the metamodern comes in.
Can I ask you a question? Roger, do you want to go?
No, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you historically, because in the integral circles, when we would look at the emergence of the postmodern or the green, there would also be very positive things, such as that gentleman up on my shoulder here, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, this egalitarian movement, the environmental movement, the cultural revolution of the 60s. These guys here helped. The music, which a lot of it, paperback writer, if you, A Day in the Life could be seen as very postmodern poetry or thought or music. And how do you fit that great? And of course, that was, there were a lot of things going on, but it was young white people being turned on to black music and psychedelics and black people standing up and saying no more. And a lot of things all came together. But how would that fit into this idea of cultural evolution and the postmodern?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. And it's interesting too, whenever you try to give a quick sort of heuristic overview of these things, you're always going to leave out certain key aspects. So thanks for that helpful kind of corrective. I wouldn't want to suggest that any of these worldviews is like, fully good or fully bad. They're just, they have these insights and they have these deficits that both have to be taken into account. So yeah, you're naming a lot of the really valuable insights that came from that postmodern moment. And I think the way of making that meaningful connection is to say that modernity had a very kind of one size fits all. This is the absolute truth. This is the one answer to everything. And didn't have and had the blind spot, let's say, of recognizing that the people advocating for that absolute truth and absolute reason tended to be white, male, European, wealthy, etc. So there was a blind spot to other perspectives and to especially the communities that had been marginalized and oppressed by the very modern project itself. And so I mean, you can also, maybe a great example of this is the story of America and its sort of founding itself, right? Which tends to be told from the perspective of the pilgrims coming from Europe and finding this lush land and all this, and then building this great nation. And there's some degree of truth to that narrative, but what it leaves out, of course, is that there was already a very rich, diverse culture of indigenous peoples here already in this land that were sometimes intentionally genocided, in other ways unintentionally, but basically a history of violence and bloodshed and oppression.
Postmodernism brought that forward.
Exactly. And, it drew attention to that there was this whole other aspect outside of the ken of this modern story of progress that we needed to take seriously. And if you read people like Howard Zinn, or, his book, like The People's History of the United States, that sort of a thing, it tells that angle. So a lot of the civil rights movement and that moment in the 60s was this explosion of appreciation, if that's a weird way of putting that, but there's sort of uprising of appreciation and the surge of awareness that that the one size fits all narrative of modernity was not fitting all these other folks, and was actually kind of stamping over them towards progress. And so there is this broadening of perspectives to try to account for that, to deal with it, to try to bring these people in. And I shouldn't say it's obviously not only coming from a Western perspective, it's those people themselves advocating for themselves and saying, hey, we're standing up against this system. This system has become a sort of issue of awareness, that people recognize that they're living in a particular social system that isn't benefiting them, that isn't serving them, and they are exercising their rights and speaking out against that. And so, yeah, I mean, similarly, you could say, things about kind of the Vietnam War resistance and a lot of that there was a sense of pushback against the modern notion of more progress, more industrialization, kind of more spread of political power throughout the globe, this sort of a thing. And people started focusing more on marginal and oppressed groups, and what was being left out of the system, something like that. So I think that that's certainly one way of telling all these stories. Obviously, and I usually say this at the outset, but these are very complex, interwoven dynamics going on in history that we have to speak of using heuristics, and we can have better or less ways of thinking about. And there are, different ways of accounting for, a lot of this, but I find this to be a very compelling one, and probably the best. And so, from the perspective that you're raising, you can then see that, again, as part of this move into the postmodern moment, it was an expansion of consciousness, you could say, an expansion of awareness and moral sensitivity to other groups of people, and the concern that if we are actually going to do this quote unquote universal thing together, then we actually need to be genuinely diverse and pluralistic, and not just hegemonic and kind of singular.
And that brings us to the title of your book, Metamodernism. Yeah. Which is so out of, or as a reaction to, as you point out, and you keep pointing out, to your credit, many ways of looking at these things. But next came Metamodernism, and perhaps since we've tied this this cultural evolution so beautifully to your own story and to John's story, perhaps you might say how you moved into your metamodern phase.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll start.
Could I ask you, Brendan, did
Yeah.
you get, when you were in the academic world, and Roger, you can respond to this too, did you get a lot of metamodernism in the academic variety that we're talking about?
In the medical school, John, they're not even up to postmodernism. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, none of this was being spoken about at all. In the academic context, I did get a lot of postmodernism, though, for sure. I was an RA for 3 years, and basically, as part of that, there was a whole RA training that was
RA is...
Oh, sorry, resident advisor. It's sort of students who live on campus, but kind of are the go-to person for people in their dorms and that sort of a thing. So there was the you could say the university administrative apparatus was deeply postmodern, very influenced by and concerned with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the kinds of workshops that go on around that. And so I got a heaping dose of that, many hours of DEI training and that sort of a thing. And a lot of that's still playing out in the university context that we see, which are saturated, in a very profound way at the moment with postmodern thought. For me, it began actually also the way that culturally, you could say, it began, which is with the arts. I was, as I said, was looking into trying to understand modernism and postmodernism. And when I was studying postmodern art, I just so much of it just did not resonate with me. obviously it itself is diverse. There were certain aspects that I grew up with that certainly
You
were.
give some examples of the art you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So some of the things that I did grow up with that actually I did like were some of the films that would be called postmodern, like Fight Club, American Beauty, Falling Down, these like dark, gritty, critiques of kind of suburban American affluent culture that and all of its consumerism and whatnot, and this sort of superficiality of it. There's a lot about postmodernism that is both that includes its own critique, you could say, and so the critique aspects of it, resonated with me very much. But the other things that didn't were the ways that the critique was itself ultimately just a continuation of the very processes it was trying to critique. So what I mean by that is, a lot of postmodern art was reflecting on the fact that culture had become very flattened, superficial, driven by consumption, no depth, all this stuff. And so, like works like by Andy Warhol, or I mentioned Jeff Koons, or Damien Hirst, all drew attention to this, right? That culture had now just become pop culture, and there was no distinction between any of these things. Robert Venturi, I think his name was, he wrote a book basically saying that the aesthetics of Las Vegas are, basically just as good as Michelangelo. You know what I mean? So like there was this sort of celebration of kitsch and the way that just appreciating that we lived in a fully consumeristic and superficial society. But the problem with it, right, is that if you make work to draw attention to that, you have to make work that is itself superficial and shallow, right? So the balloon dog is a send up of, just shallow culture, but in the process, you're just making more shallow culture, right? And so this becomes a kind of problem where you're not really able to get outside the critique of postmodernism. And folks like David Foster Wallace, who's considered by many to be like a very early forerunner of metamodernism, really put his finger on this problem, that when you use irony and cynicism, you just wind up making things worse. And so the only way kind of out of the trap of critique is to start affirming things, to risk the rolled eyes and the kind of yawn and the, oh, how banal is that, right? So much of postmodern art was about shock and squalor and surprise, and there was this desire to disturb people.
Would you include punk in that?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I mean, that's kind of, punk and grunge was sort of an angry response to these dynamics that young people were seeing and rejecting it, for sure. Radiohead, I would also put in that category. Now, Radiohead, I mean, I love Radiohead's music, but it's thoroughly postmodern. It's all of its lyrics are just dripping with this irony, right? Everything in its right place is like this send up of how people think in the suburban world that they're critiquing. But again, if you just wind up creating all this art that is itself cynical and it doesn't move beyond its own critique. So the work I was writing at the time was not in that vein. And so when I discovered people talking about metamodernism, I got really excited. At the time, they were just talking about this new surge in the arts where people seem to be taking a stand on values and being willing to make claims about things knowing they're probably wrong, and having sort of the risk now became being earnest, right? Before it used to be, oh, we're cool because we're cynical and skeptical. Now it was becoming cool to be earnest and maybe even a little hokey. And so this was this aesthetic shift that people started to notice, and it didn't conform to the postmodern paradigm anymore. So people were like, we have to theorize this differently. And so that's where the term metamodernism really comes from and gets going from. And there was a sense, though, and I think this is the key, and it's a key part to the way I frame this in my book. This turn to sincerity and earnestness, and single entendre principles, as David Foster Wallace called it. It wasn't an earnestness that was truly naive. It was aware of the fact that it was being earnest, right? It was aware of the fact that it could be cynical, It knows what cynicism is. It grew up with cynicism and skepticism, but it's going to be earnest anyway. So
Or
it's not just a
in your book,
return.
innocent beyond complexity.
Yeah, it's this sort of second naivete. It's this informed naivete, as the metamodern scholars would talk about it. And it's the return of a kind of simplicity, or the ability to be simple and immediate and sort of unreflective, as a product of reflection itself. And so this sort of new paradigm really spoke to me aesthetically. It was a lot of the sort of art that I naturally enjoyed, Wes Anderson films and certain kinds of folk music and whatnot. And it was the sort of work that I myself was writing. So I really found this to be something very valuable. And so I started working within that paradigm. And since then, this whole kind of metamodern conversation has really flourished. But I'll pause there because I'm saying a lot of stuff. So maybe we want to.
Well, well, you've given a beautiful biographical account of opening into this, and I was intrigued and struck by, as someone who's aesthetically challenged, I'm colorblind. I have I'm almost tone deaf. I have almost no knowledge of the outside world. But so aesthetics, is not a road I would come in by. So I'm intrigued that you did. But you've given us a beautiful account of your own opening to this metamodern phase. And now maybe could you delineate what is this metamodernism that we're beginning to see emerging, and hopefully we're beginning to live in?
Yeah. So the way it was initially kind of talked about was that, as I was saying, right, there's a return of sincerity and sort of a moving past irony, but through irony. There's a what's called ironic sincerity, right? That you retain a sense of that postmodern awareness, but you still act anyway. You still affirm things anyway. And because of all that, even though there's a certain kind of sense of return of things that you might have seen in these earlier, less reflective modes of thinking, they're not just simple like movements back to those things, because the way that they're showing up is sort of inflected through a new self-awareness, you could say. And so this is how metamodernism really shows up in the conversation around 2010, 2012. And that was sort of the cultural studies framing of it. And then as I said, that was really insightful and very helpful for me. And there I could give more aesthetic examples of this, but it does show up in the arts, as we could also say many other worldviews do as well, right? When you look at the early Renaissance, it's not just that new kinds of thinking and philosophy and science are being done; it's that you're seeing the emergence of new kinds of art. And that there's something about the artist as being sort of a forerunner of some of these modes of thinking. Postmodernism itself, you could identify certain early forms of going all the way back to the Dadaists, in the early 20th century, or even the early Impressionists, who were all about sort of perspective, right? So there's something about the artist showing up first and enacting this thing kind of just intuitively, that then people start to reflect upon and start to theorize about. Then Hansi Freinock's works, which were mentioned earlier, those show up around 2017. And what happens with those is Hansi Freinock is this figure who is writing this kind of metamodern philosophy, picks up the term that's going on in this cultural conversation, and brings some more theorizing to it. And a lot of that theory is informed by integral philosophy. And so a lot of that is kind of bringing some of the cultural evolution lens to this, and it's bringing a developmental lens to this. So that happens in a big way, and that adds a whole new layer and sense of depth to this, and also is where the integral and metamodern conversation starts to link up in an interesting way. But then
and I would add positive responses to these very negative things that postmodernism revealed.
Yes.
Clearly.
Yeah.
And Hansi is putting it back together in a way that this is a way that gives us hope. This is a way, the listening society.
Exactly.
There's really great ideas. Bildung is another fantastic idea that was brought forward in that.
Yep.
So I think that's a good example of what you're talking about as far as a postmodern still being kind of cynical, but at the same time, the good, the true, the beautiful, hope, positivity.
Yeah. And that sensibility runs throughout all forms of metamodern thinking, that there's a move from cynicism, skepticism, doubt, to hope and value and belief and this aspirational idealism of some kind. So there is this move from the negative to the positive in a very real way in all forms of metamodernism. Yeah, that kind of radical perspectival relativism that postmodernism had introduced starts to become let's say, organized in a coherent way by this new kind of metamodern framing. And again, informed by various forms of integral thought in the process, where actually, yes, we can recognize that everything has a perspective, everything's coming from a particular angle on reality, but that doesn't mean that we're just floating in a chaotic realm of different perspectives without any ability to relate them to each other. We can actually relate perspectives one to the other.
Or that all perspectives are equally valuable. I mean, some perspectives come from a higher place of complexity and serve more than other perspectives.
Exactly. And this is where a lot of the complexity thinking really enters in a big way, where, gosh, I mean, it's hard to know where to even begin to try to summarize all these things. I guess, obviously, if people are interested in this, they can read the book, because I try to offer a synthesis of all the metamodern stuff that starts to show up and try to suggest the kind of deep gestalt or unifying framework that brings it all together in a coherent way. But I guess I would just note that, like, what I found interesting and fascinating about this metamodern moment was that there were multiple people independently using this term, and yet they were all seemingly converging upon very similar ideas. Jason Ananda Josephson Storm, who's a philosopher and an historian and involved in a religious studies department at Williams College, he writes a systematic philosophy, which he calls metamodernism, which is a future of theory. And he's coming at it from a very different direction than Hansi Freinacht or the early cultural theorists, and yet comes to very similar kinds of orientations about things. And I think it was, Roger, you mentioned earlier, the negation of the negation. That is a big framing that Storm's work brings to all this, because you can look at postmodernism as this negation of what had been. It's a post reflection on modernity. It's this critique, it's this skepticism and cynicism about it. And Storm calls that philosophy under the sign of the negative. Everything is interrogated and taken apart and deconstructed and tried to see, what's wrong here and all that. But what's interesting about that move is you can carry it through so far that it winds up kind of flipping over on itself. If you negate negation, you get something positive, which again is this metamodern move away from negativity towards positivity and towards hope, from melancholy and despair. And so, point being, there's a very rich set of ideas that start to show up onto the scene all around the same time, 2017, 2020, 2021, this whole period. And this really kind of has a sense of, cultural intensity to it, a kind of movement around it. And there's some deep stuff operating at the philosophical level, at the aesthetic level. And it seems like the dawn of a new kind of worldview. And so that is sort of in rough outline, some of the contours of the metamodern moment. But then, depending on how deep into this you want to go, we can try to talk about what are some of the deeper ideas and the logic behind all this and the stuff I get into my book.
Do you see that there's any progress in inseminating the metamodern into the very, very postmodern academic culture that we found on our campuses?
I think it's absolutely necessary, and I'm trying to do a lot of work around this myself. So, a lot of, and Storm's work focuses on this issue probably the most. So much of what's happened in academia is that our categories and fields of knowledge have been deconstructed, right? So if you take an anthropology class, which is ostensibly about human culture, one of the first things you'll do is learn that culture is a problematic term and doesn't exist. If you do what I did, which is study religion, you will spend most of your 4 years exploring how religion is a made-up category that needs to be deconstructed, and so on and so forth. Right? You study art, and then you get into the issue of what is art and who decides, and isn't this a power play to separate high and low and all stuff. So most of the humanities, especially, have witnessed this sort of deconstructive process that Storm makes the point is reaching just radically diminishing returns at this point. Even though people aren't using the term postmodernism so much, it's still the case that the kind of standard operating procedure to write a thesis or a work or whatever is to take a topic, see how you can break it down, break it up, deconstruct it, and then sort of leave it in rubble. And, now you get your PhD. And so that is having not just intellectual sort of issues with stymieing stultification or at least stunting of intellectual progress. It's also having cultural impacts too, because this stuff leaks out into culture. People come out of the university sort of disillusioned profoundly, thinking everything is just an object of power analysis and this sort of a thing. Anyway, long story short, yes, the university system has become just thoroughly saturated with postmodern thought and isn't productively generating much, to the point where it's produced a profound legitimization crisis for the humanities themselves. And now humanities departments their funding's getting cut, and they can't tell you why it shouldn't be, because what are their topics of study anyway? So long story short, yeah, we need a paradigm shift. We need a future for theory that moves us beyond the impasses of postmodern deconstruction, and that is what metamodernism would offer. So, especially Jason Storm's work is essential reading for people who care about this topic, because my hope is that this really will begin to take on, get some traction in the academy. I'm working with Jason on an academic journal called Metamodern Theory and Praxis, and we are hoping for that to be sort of the first, gesture in this direction. And there are some promising signs that things are starting to move, more in that direction. I think the more that we see things deteriorate, we will start to see also more hopefully constructive responses as people say, hey, this really isn't working. Things are falling apart. We've really got to shift gears. And I get emails almost, let's say, weekly from people saying, hey, I'm studying metamodernism for my architecture thesis or for my, this or that, right? And so this is starting to make its way into the academy in a big way. And I think that that's very encouraging.
I'm relieved to hear that. And you just gave a beautiful account of the way in which metamodernism has undermined the academic enterprise. And I want to just point to something you are very aware of, and maybe it'll invite you to speak to the way it has leaked into the culture in ways which are also destructive. I think of, for example, the way certain cynical politicians have picked up on the idea of no truth, etc. And fake news is now, everything so much is being undermined. And also something that Ken Wilber wrote very eloquently about is the fact that we now, for the first time in history, have four major worldviews or developmental stages operating in our culture at the same time. And that so many of our cultural conflicts actually express not just different perspectives at the same level, but unrecognized cross-level warfare. The cultural warfare or the cultural conflicts reflect so much the fact that the different developmental stages, different worldviews, different cultural moments not being recognized. Love to have you speak to that.
Yeah, and I mean, you could go even further. I think Hansi's work is helpful for this, to appreciate it's not just that there are different worldviews of different complexity levels all interacting, across each other, but that individuals at different levels of, you could say, psychological complexity are also operating worldview systems that are beyond their ken, intellectually, you could say. And so it's not just that different worldviews are clashing based on their ideas, it's that different worldviews are getting picked up and sort of oversimplified and confused at levels that aren't really properly able to operate those operating systems. And I think there's a good case to be made that a lot of the culture wars stem from maybe even largely or majority of that dynamic where, you're 18 years old, you go to university, and then you're told that, basically you've got to deconstruct everything and everything's just power and everything's oppression and this sort of a thing. 18 is probably not the level at which you're fully ready or able to really digest, the depths of deconstructive theory and the full range of complexity of the histories of colonialism and this sort of a thing. You're just presented with it, and then it gets kind of downward assimilated, and then what it winds up doing is kind of getting acted out at a way in a way that is actually kind of psychologically at a level much more like sort of traditional dogma basically. So postmodernism becomes the new dogma for a lot of people, or traditionalism. There's a million ways this plays out, and Corey David Barker talks about diagonal complexity. It's not just vertical or horizontal. It's these ways that things get kind of mutated across different levels of complexity. So all of that is going on, and we have a very messy, a situation with a lot of permutations, let's just say, incalculable numbers of permutations going on with the relationship of individuals and collective worldview systems, that seem to be challenging one another. So yeah, that's the big challenge. I do think that metamodernism offers some tools to be able to help us navigate that dynamic. One, just by making us aware of that way of framing the issue, which remains blind, which many people remain blind to because they just see different people's perspectives, right? And so there's a framing that itself can help bring some clarity. But I think one of the biggest things is that even though there's all this stuff that's incredibly valuable to be brought in from the postmodern framework, a lot of which we've already spoken to, there are also ways in which its logic has reached a sort of dead end or a cul-de-sac, or it reaches a limit that then it needs to transcend, in the same way that I reached a limit with my traditional religion that I had to transcend and break through in order to get somewhere that could be more adaptive for me. And so we're kind of there collectively with a lot of the postmodern forms of thought. And so we see that playing out politically, where we've deeply collectively internalized the notion that everyone's just coming from a different perspective, and therefore who's to say, essentially. And also people have taken to heart that power seems to be the only kind of adjudicating factor here. So we wind up caring a lot about the words people use, because some people think we can just fix society if we change the words. We have also people trying to get control of power, political power, in order to basically just silence their detractors. All those are obviously pathological responses to these issues. And I think that we're just seeing that the fissuring into micro narratives and the rejection of truth is not working. And another big factor I think that's really catalyzed this is that postmodernism used to be a kind of framework that primarily leftist politics used for emancipatory reasons, right? You would try to pick up notions of deconstruction so that you could show that
atheistic, I might say also.
Say again?
Also atheistic with the far kind of
sure.
left.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, and so that was sort of the general thrust of the postmodern approach, was to deconstruct things in order to try to undermine what was deemed oppressive power structures, let's say. But one of the things that's happened in a big way over the past 10 years is that postmodernism as a general intellectual toolkit is now being employed very much by the right. And you mentioned political figures talking about alternative facts and just the kind of nonchalance about anything having to do with reality, everything being superficial. There's no depth. Everything is. So I think one of the big stories of what's that?
To choose your own facts or make them up.
Exactly. And so I think that the sort of intellectual, the kind of leftist intelligentsia were a bit shocked when they wound up being hoisted by their own petard with a lot of these tools of deconstruction and relativization and whatnot, in a way that now those on the left really care a lot about truth. Democracy dies in darkness, and we have to, we need our journalists to fight against the encroachments of democracy and this sort of a thing. All of which I'm very sympathetic to, right? But it's a bit ironic at this point that we've seen this shift, towards new deployments of postmodern thought, in a way that now there are new reactions to postmodern thought, and people are starting to care a lot more about truth. So all those things are going on right now in a way that is leading to some pretty devastating effects in our kind of culture more broadly. And Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. I mean, so, and I guess one of the last things I'll say about how metamodernism brings some clarity to this too is that it recognizes that doesn't work. That even though grand narratives of truth might be dangerous, as the postmodernists realize, they also seem to be necessary to some degree if we're going to have a working social organization of whatever that is, a community or a nation that can have a shared sense of reality. We can't all be working with radically different micro narratives. We need some kind of a shared narrative, something to unite the disintegrated notion of reality. And so rather than a sort of grand narrative being seen as something inherently oppressive, the way postmodernists used to see it, it's starting to become clear that we actually use narratives to bring us together, that there can be healthy and salutary ways that truth and even power can be deployed for the good of people. So a lot of that cynicism and skepticism is starting to, fall away as people adopt more metamodernist stances of trying to listen to each other. You mentioned the listening society. Trying to, in Storm's work, he talks about reaffirming values again, not just saying what we're against, but what are we for, right? This is a big thing. The problem, right, is that when people say they're for something, then you've opened yourself up to critique and attack. And yet now it's sort of the vanguard of people who are willing to take the risk of actually saying, these are my values, and these have been values that we've been operating from in the past. We've just we've kind of hidden them or put them underground. So yeah, I could go on, and I don't mean to talk so much, but it's a very rich topic.
Well, it's a very rich topic and very important. This is one of the great issues of our time: how we recognize what is going on in the cultural conflicts and miasma we're currently in, and how we find ways out. And I think you're doing extremely important work with this, bringing an understanding of a potential worldview and value system and understanding that could be very healing for our culture. And of course, as you point out beautifully in your book, Metamodernism itself will in turn be recognized as limited, and hopefully there'll be something that grows beyond it. Just as Ken Wilber has often said, integral is the biggest picture I can see on the planet at the moment, and something better, bigger and better will come. But for right now, it seems like something we really need. And it's no exaggeration to say the health and perhaps even viability of our civilization may depend on both our individual growth and maturation and our collective cultural growth and evolution to a place in which we can make sense of the enormous complexity we currently face and respond to it with at least sufficient wisdom to get us through this threat to our civilization and survival.
Yeah. One more thing I want to emphasize too about all this is that complexity is an important framework in metamodern thought, something I care a lot about. And one thing that we see with complex systems is that they form these moments of order and organization. Well, you can call it tractors, right? When you've got a certain kind of just certain kinds of dynamics that allow them to kind of find this little island of coherence. But if the conditions change, that's going to begin to destabilize. And what you can see then is either basically a breakdown to a less complex organizational structure or a breakthrough to a more complex organizational structure. And the challenge right now collectively for us all is that we're seeing a lot of breakdown, and we're seeing a lot of moving back to less complex framing devices for understanding reality. Which is just another way of talking about certain kinds of regressive and reactionary modes of thought that become really attractive to people when things are really chaotic and disturbed and uncertain. And so this has been really one of my most important emphases that and one of the things that attracts me so much to a metamodern framing is because it is trying to move us through and beyond these issues towards a more complex outcome. But what I see so much of is the danger of this seeking for comfort in modes of thinking that are not of sufficient complexity to meet the nature of the challenges that we face as a collective. And so there has recently been a huge kind of upswell in certain parts of well, there's just in general terms, you could just say there's been an upswell in returns to certain forms of religious thinking that, I think we can try to engage but move forward into more complex formulations. Whereas if people are looking for, I don't know, a bit more certainty and a bit more kind of dogma that they can feel comfortable in, that's certainly an understandable orientation. But ultimately, that's going to cause more disruption and destabilization down the line in the kind of complex world that we're living in. So I think it's absolutely essential that people, some folks anyway, can try to break through to this other way of seeing that can hopefully get us beyond the limits of our worldviews at the moment, and help get us through and beyond our current hangups in a way that allows us to keep moving forward rather than kind of falling back. So maybe that's a obvious or trite point, but it's something I see so much of right now, and it makes me concerned. So a big part of my work is aimed at trying to address that problem.
Well, it's a very profound and vital concern, and thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, I wanted to share something the other day in preparing for this conversation. I've been digging into your work and podcasts online and stuff like that, but I'd also been reading about the reproducibility issue in science, that they found out that 75% of the articles that were published in these very prestigious peer-reviewed journals in science weren't reproducible. And in psychology, same thing. The journals, peer-reviewed, et cetera, were about 60%. So it creates a complete, crisis. What can we believe anymore? And partially systemic, parish or public, publish or perish,
right?
Academia, and especially in these highly regarded magazines. And what they want are positive results. So people will not write papers on the negative results, but and keep doing the experiment until they get the result they want. And there's also the issue of the observer affects the observed. You get often what you're looking for, and we know in quantum physics, you look at one of these entities in one way, it's a wave that stretches out into infinity, or it's a discrete particle. So what does that do to the whole idea of objective science and science itself? And I went meta on it. And what I came up with is that when you're looking at these experiments, not only do you have to consider the object of the experiment, you have to consider the experimenter and what they bring to it. What is their paradigm? What is their, what are the financials? What are they expecting to find? And what are they, putting into it? So when you get it to the next level, all of a sudden, to me, I was like, well, this is a brave new world, but it's very encouraging. You just have to include both sides and look at it in a more equal, in a nuanced, meta way, if you will. And it's kind of this stuff works. I had my moment.
Yeah. I think that's always the move that we want to try to do. And that's, is that meta move, which is, all right, what weren't we taking into account that we need to take into account? And I think that postmodernism, raised the question, but it was sort of an incomplete turn, because its initial response, if there was one, was we can't know, everything is kind of inherently flawed or prejudiced or biased or what have you. But that's only a half turn. It's sort of like seeing the problem, but then just skewing towards, I guess it's fundamental. But actually, it's not a fundamental problem per se. It's a relative problem. If we can expand our scope enough, then we can try to integrate more of the factors, the variables that are influencing the kinds of science that we should be doing, and then we can actually be doing better science. So,
Exactly.
so yeah, that's the sort of move that we should be doing everywhere, is trying to factor in more of the system itself. And this gets us to, again, kind of systems thinking or meta systems thinking, where we need to apply the logic of systems to be able to more appropriately do knowledge creation. A lot of classic sort of scientific knowledge production in sort of the STEM fields is largely about sort of linear relationships, right? Isolate the variable and see exactly what, what the natural relationship is between this variable and a given outcome versus a control, et cetera. And that's very kind of linear in thinking. But as you say, what the scientist is then missing from their scope is that they are a scientist and they are doing an experiment and they have a context they're operating in, and let's just say the impact that their work is having is part of a system that they are themselves enmeshed in. So it's actually a nonlinear system. Um, and that it becomes increasingly difficult because it becomes increasingly complex to appreciate all the dynamics that wind up getting folded in here. But those are the sorts of moves that we can do to then say, oh, okay, if I want to do better science, I need to be considering more of the full scope of the experiment, you could say, which isn't just limited to my petri dish or what have you. It's actually limited to the entire laboratory, and actually the laboratory as being enmeshed in a cultural knowledge production system, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pretty key. And so some of the metamodern frameworks, like the unified theory of knowledge that Greg Enriquez has developed, starts to do those sorts of things by putting the knower in the context of the known, and helps us get a view from complexity, at least. So yeah.
And I think you just gave us a great summary, and of course there'd be many possible summaries of the value that you're bringing in with your metamodernism. That is an encouragement to look at more of the picture, both in terms of the content, but also recursively looking back at the perspective from which we're looking, and at ourselves, and looking at ourselves. And Brendan, this has been an extraordinary conversation, just so very rich. And we could obviously keep going, but I guess we have to acknowledge our limits. But is there anything else you'd like to add?
Maybe just to piggyback quickly on that last thought you brought up as a way of tying it all together, which is that one of the things I try to talk about in the book is that metamodernism is a worldview of worldviews, or it's a cultural logic of cultural logics. It is doing that recursive thing of trying to kind of expand beyond the frame that we've been working in, which has reached its limits, to try to see what else is going on. And what it discovers is that what's going on is this process of recursive reflection. And if we take that process seriously, it can point the path forward to more productive avenues of thought. And that actually, you can even make the case, I think very compellingly, that this is what cultural evolution has always been about, what it's been doing, how it's been unfolding, that the modern thought shows up, objectifies the pre-modern, reflects on it, critiques it, and tries to transcend it. The postmodern thought shows up, objectifies the modern thought, reflects upon it, critiques it, tries to transcend it, and so on. That there is always this sort of looking over our shoulder at what has been, what were the limits, what wasn't being accounted for, how do we tie things into greater networks of relationality and try to build that into a more comprehensive system. And then when that system reaches its limits, we have to deconstruct it to try to get beyond that system, go outside of it, and find something more comprehensive and encompassing. And that's a very different picture of cultural evolution than the sort you'll get in, for example, Harari's *Sapiens*, which just says, things change and there's not really any way we can look at any of this as, going anywhere or saying anything or related to value. I think that it gives a new sense, a new narrative about our history and about who we are and what we're up to, that I think is a hopeful narrative, and it is an aspirational one, and it has a directionality that can allow us to move beyond the kind of radical relativism and the fragmented, fractured micro narratives of postmodernism to a framework where we can actually relate to each other in deeper ways, and find deeper modes of understanding and compassion and empathy with one another from that frame. And so I'm hopeful that that's where the future is tending.
May it be so. And Brendan, you are certainly doing wonderful work to encourage that the very evolution which you're describing and analyzing. And I have to say, this is a potentially incredibly complex topic, and both John and I were so impressed that you managed to make metamodernism and cultural evolution come alive in a lively, clear way in your own book, Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. And you have, of course, your podcast, Metamodern Spirituality. You have other books, so you are quite a resource. And thank you so much for being with us. It's really been a mind-opening discussion, and a very rich one, and hopefully a real contribution to the very evolution you're describing.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to hold up the mirror for you that the depth of your scholarship is really astounding.
Thank you.
Really amazing. And I also sense that the purity of your motivation or your heart is really, really good too. So you put, the brain and the heart together, and in some schools that's called enlightenment. So you're bringing very enlightened views and energy into this conversation. And I really hope that your voice grows, and you've got so much to contribute, and it's very meaningful.
I deeply appreciate that, and I'm honored to hear all of that. And I guess I would just also humbly say that I feel very much that I'm just synthesizing a lot of the profound insights of many other people who have come before, and that's really a lot of the whole idea of it. Really is a reflection on what's been and trying to carry that forward. And so I hope these works that I'm putting out are helpful and are doing what you say and helping to evolve things in that direction. But I feel like I'm only just sort of a messenger and someone trying to communicate and distill and spread these ideas that I have been the beneficiary of from so many other thinkers, especially from the integral tradition and others. So that's very kind of you to say, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. This has been great.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you, Brendan.